India, as a socio-cultural entity, has always maintained an inherently hybrid identity. The subcontinent, long before the nation, operated largely in a cosmopolitan polyphony. Before the Mughals were the Turks, the Greeks before them, and of course the Aryans. Countless plunders and invasions have marred and maimed the subcontinent. But the unique Indian spirit finds a way to rise above. She takes in and organically assimilates her invaders' culture into her own native narrative. For better or for worse, India's native flavors and sensibilities have intermingled with the colors and textures of foreign lands. An identity in constant flux, constant conflict, and evolution. An insight into this complex nature of this nation is offered by a study of the sensibilities and ideals that ripple through literature and fashion of its times. Of all her invaders, few rival the brute and senseless nature of the British Empire. The Indo Anglican encounter indelibly changed the face and fate of India. The cultural identity we celebrate today, 75 years post independence, is one wrought by conscious melding, acceptance, and rejection of cultural elements. The most visible and tangible markers of these changes are the literature and fashion of those rapidly evolving years that make up our recent cultural memory. English literature and fashion proper on the Indian subcontinent are relatively young. Both stood formative in shaping the nation today. English literature arrived on our shores with the British in the late 1700s. India's engagement with the language was sparked in the mid 19th century. Development of Indian writing in English and fashion in pre independent India was divided into two distinctive phases. Phase 1 was between 1830 to 1900, and phase 2 was between 1900 to 1945. With regard to Indian writing in English in the first phase, the setting up of printing press by Christian missionaries and the Orientalist study and repackaging of existing Indian thought and culture paved a way for the small group of Western educated Indians to envision for themselves in the foreign language. In the literature of this era, we see a very Anglican centric mode of writing, immaculately structured articulation, and prose borrowing heavily from the sensibilities of British romantics, of the likes of John Keats. The Indian touch, however, is undeniable. The language is aspirational but panders to the elite sensibility and seeks a sort of validation from the West. This class of writers sought to hone and make the language their own after their education abroad. Even at the peak of this phase, the language still remained inaccessible to the majority of Indians. Notable contributors to this phase include Dean Mohammed, who wrote the first Indian book in English, Toru Dutt, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, Henry Louis Derisio, all of whom pioneered Indian writing in English. Post the swell of this phase, writers moved away from romantic ideals and to rather urgent, more relevant subjects of nationalism and ideas of a free, united nation, emancipated from foreign rule, invaded their writing. On the fashion front, The genesis of the modern sari blouse is considered a watershed moment in Indian fashion history. Again, a pandering to Anglican sensibilities can be seen. Outside of coerced adhesion to Victorian codes of modesty and propriety, this was the first step towards empowering the Indian woman. A sense of dignity and visibility in the then cultural context was achieved with the modern blouse. The extravagance of the British influence on Indian fashion can be spotted easily among the royals and aristocratic class, the same layer that freely engaged with the English language. Artifacts of the European influence can be seen in sari pin brooches, hairdos of Victorian and modern era, sported by women. The aristocratic class of men wore shirts, pants, blazers, and a proper suit, and the Indian mode of fashion was made proper and palatable to the ideals of the West. The second phase in pre independent English writing in India was set ablaze by the urgency of emancipation from foreign rule. This is overtly seen in this quote by K.S. Iyengar. Overnight, men of word became men of action, and men of action became men of word. Exercises in aesthetics were largely abandoned to tackle the urgency of social unrest and resistance against the increasing domination and subordination of the country under the British rule. The language came to be more accessible to the common man after Lord Macaulay's Minute on Education came into full realization, which transformed the English education in India. It aimed to produce men brown in skin but white in thought. The First and Second World Wars inducted many Indians into the British organized workforce. The British administration was conducted wholly in English by this time. This class of English speaking Indians acted as a bridge, an intermediate between the British and non English speaking India. In a sort of poetic irony, the language that was taught with the aim to better enslave helped in creating a functional secular linked language whose network would unite the nation and later topple the British yoke. Indian English literature and the vernacular literature of this phase was filled with political thought and socio realism. Authors like R.K. Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand, Sarojini Naidu, Raja Rao, B.R. Ambedkar, Munshi Premchand, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, Manishankar Mukherjee, Satyajit Ray. All of these authors made the common man their heroes and their troubles and joys of everyday life their grand epics. The literature of this era mainly focused on socio political realism. Fashion in this era, like language, abandoned aesthetics to meet functional utilitarian ends. The glittering 9 yards plus sari was downsized. A more functional costume emerged. Salwar kameez and kurta dhotis dominated. Gandhian thought influenced this period's fashion very notably. With the independence movement in full swing, there was boycotting and purging of foreign goods. Particularly, foreign clothes were burnt in public spaces. To salvage the textile and cotton industries that were decimated by the British, Gandhi advocated Swadeshi and importance of homegrown Deshi industries. The ravage of wars, protests, and rejection of foreign clothes required fashion of this period to be frugal. Khadi transformed the fashion of the years counting down to independence. Clothes reflected the rural aesthetic. Modern clothes were thrown out for in favor of clothes that represented ideas of patriotism and nationalism. Kurta pajamas, Nehru jackets, Gandhi topis, and simple cotton saris became commonplace. The ideals of literature and fashion of this phase became the core of the patriotic spirit of the nation to come.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
In post independent India, immediately after the ideals of the new nation were framed, culture was reorganized and slowly solidified. There was an air of freedom. With freedom came the ability to explore, experiment, and express. In the wake of independence, India was left with an army of tailors and clerks, unable to create outside formats. With the country engaged in nation building, there was a reconstitution of thought, blending both native and non native elements to create something uniquely Indian. Once the nation was consolidated, there was a departure from rural aesthetics to more of the newly forming urban middle class. There was a large scale migration of rural India into urban settings, with newly set up industries and universities offering incentives of a better life. There was a boom in experimental writing. Many English literary forms were explored with the Indian ethos and psyche at its core. Fiction writing, in particular, flourished in post independent India. The focus of writing shifted from social and politically relevant themes to those of individual identity and experience, especially nostalgia and the struggle of identity post colonial rule. The aftermath of the colonial experience is implicit in most of the writing of this period. Writers of note of this period are Kushwant Singh, Kamala Markandaya, Babani Bhattacharya, Amitav Ghosh, Salman Rushdie, Ruskin Bond, Kamala Das, Anita Desai, Shashi Deshpande, and others. In their work, there was an explosion of creative thought, the driving impulse being self expression. This carried on into the fashion trends of the time. The Indian film industry had its golden era post independence, and it greatly informed and influenced Indian aesthetics.
ये क्या? ये कोई कपड़ा है? क्यों क्यों? ये तो जाली की तरह है. कोई दूसरा कपड़ा दो ना.
तुम्हें यही पहनना होगा. आजकल की मॉडर्न लड़की सब ऐसे ही कपड़ा पहनती हैं.
There was a revival of lavish Indian wear like the anarkali, lehengas, saris, and tight blouses. The glamour of the 60s, 70s, and 80s were unparalleled and was an experiment in Indianizing the global culture. Women sported tight blouses, kurtis, high beehive hairdos in line with the Western model, but in a distinctively Indian mode. High fashion swept through the urban middle class. A need to be modern citizens of the world was seen. Tensions between holding on to tradition and moving forward with the rest of the world was being navigated. The freedom of expression and experimentation was at an absolute high. Writing and fashion truly came into its own in this era. In the later years, post the 1970s, divides of class, religion, and caste became unavoidably apparent. New radical ideology now took control of Indian literature and fashion. Outdated moral codes were disposed of by the liberal class. This conflict of tradition and modernity was still in perpetual tug of war. Internal political shifts and alignments brought clear distinction between the liberal and conservative sections. The liberal class sought to delve further into modern thoughts of expression, while the conservatives harked to the glorious past. Literature and fashion became commodities during this period. Literature was no longer restrained by the idea of what was considered proper. There was free exploration of taboo subjects like sex and the like. Writers like Arundhati Roy, Jhumpa Lahiri, Vikram Seth, Chetan Bhagat, Aravind Adiga, and others spearhead this current era. A liberating phase, there was a chutnification of languages. Imports from vernacular were presented verbatim in writing. New words and phrases exclusively Indian were born. A section of expatriate writers created the now well known diasporic writing. Subaltern literature also branched out into its own. Fashion saw new innovations and bold experimentations. Films and magazines featured skimpy clothes, jeans, hairdos imported directly from the West with little to no alteration. Saris and Indian wear were considered stuffy and exchanged for the new and popular Western wear. Mass production of idea and material proved a boon, and fast fashion and literature tore through the nation. Unprecedented consumerism paved the way for low quality fashion and literature. Literature and fashion was now a profitable commodity. Neither literature or fashion had any qualms of turning a profit at the cost of quality. Mainstream literature and fashion both fell into the trap of capitalism. As we continue to grapple with this new and fast age, many are left rootless and wondering what the Indian identity is all over again. Who's to say what's Indian and what's not? India, as a functional concept, is not held down by strictures of native or non native. She is all that and more, a non monolithic cultural spectacle that eludes easy comprehension and categorization. We are all hybrid beings filled with ideas, thoughts that have flowed down to us through the ages. We should embrace our differences and embrace the multifaceted culture that we have come to inherit.